Before names, you are a royal manicurist in ancient Egypt, and the man beside you is the only person in the palace who actually knows you. Your name is Nyankhnum. His is Khnumhotep. You work together in the court of Pharaoh Niuserre, roughly 2,400 years before the Common Era. When you die, you are buried together in a single tomb at Saqqara. Your faces carved into the wall, nose to nose, in the exact pose Egyptian art reserved for husbands and wives. Your names translate directly, joined in life and joined in death. Egyptologists found the tomb and spent decades explaining it away. Brothers, they said, except your wives and children are also carved into those walls, in smaller, secondary positions. In Egyptian funerary tradition, the person you faced in death was the person who mattered most. You were facing him. The debate ran for over 50 years before most scholars quietly accepted what the walls had always shown. Across Mesopotamia, a clay tablet nearly 3,000 years old was doing something different, listing sex between men as an omen, not a sin, not a crime, an outcome. Good or bad, depending on your position and your partner's status. A civilization taking notes, not passing judgment. Nobody had a word for any of this yet. That came later. And in Greece, they built an entire rulebook around it. Rules and shame. You are a young man in 5th century Athens. An older, respected citizen has taken an interest in you. He brings gifts, a rooster, a hare, both acceptable. He approaches you in the gymnasium, in public, where everyone can see. That part matters. The relationship between an Erastes, the older pursuer, and an Eromenos, the younger pursued, was a recognized social institution. It had rules, unwritten ones, which made them more dangerous. You had to appear moderately interested, too eager, and you were shameful. A boy who wanted it, which was the worst thing you could be. Too cold, and you insulted a respected man. The performance required was constant and exhausting. The line between honored and humiliated was invisible until you crossed it. The sacred band of Thebes took a different approach. A military commander named Gorgidas built an entire fighting unit of 150 pairs of male lovers, 300 men total, on a single premise. No soldier abandons the person he loves. They were undefeated for 33 years, until Philip of Macedon broke them at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. He found their bodies in formation, every single one facing the enemy. Then there's Sappho, a poet from the island of Lesbos, whose writing described desire between women with a precision that made later civilizations deeply uncomfortable. Most of her work, 9 volumes, was lost. What survived did so mostly in fragments, quoted inside other people's texts. Rome inherited all of this, and immediately rewrote the one rule that mattered most: power and Rome. In Rome, nobody cared who you slept with. They cared deeply about how. A Roman senator stands in court, mid-accusation. His rival, he claims, has received another man, not committed violence, not stolen public funds, received another man. The courtroom understands immediately. The career is already over. This was the active/passive rule, and it was the most important social law in Roman sexual life. A free male citizen could sleep with slaves, prostitutes, or foreign men without touching his reputation, as long as he was the dominant party. The passive role belonged to slaves, foreigners, and the defeated. For a citizen to occupy it was to place himself in that same category, below the law, below respect. It had nothing to do with morality, everything to do with power. The Lex Scantinia technically criminalized passive behavior in free Roman men. It was rarely enforced. That selective enforcement was the point. The law existed not to punish but to threaten, a blade kept visible so it never needed to be drawn. Then comes Hadrian and Antinous, the emperor of Rome and a young man from Bithynia, in modern-day Turkey. Their relationship was documented, public, and completely unambiguous. In 130 AD, while sailing the Nile, Antinous drowned. He was around 19 years old. Hadrian's grief was so raw and so visible, it embarrassed the Roman Senate. He named a city after the boy. He commissioned hundreds of statues. He had him declared a god. An emperor had loved someone and refused to pretend otherwise. The East handled this differently, with poetry, ritual, and a lot more paperwork. Love and ritual. In Ming Dynasty China, same-sex love wasn't whispered about. It was categorized. Scholars documented 10 distinct phases of male romantic attachment, each one named, each one described with the same seriousness reserved for medicine or philosophy. This wasn't underground literature. It sat on shelves. The culture had looked at this part of human behavior and decided it was worth understanding. The most famous story came earlier, from the Han Dynasty. Emperor Ai was in bed with his companion Dong Xian when he needed to rise for court. Dong Xian had fallen asleep across the emperor's sleeve. Rather than wake him, the emperor cut the sleeve off his own robe and left him sleeping. The gesture entered the Chinese language. For centuries, the cut sleeve was the literary phrase for same-sex love, a whole dimension of human experience, carried inside a single image. In feudal Japan, the structure was more formal. Wakashudo, the way of the youth, governed relationships between adult samurai and adolescent apprentices. Written contracts sometimes outlined the terms. Poetry marked the milestones. The apprentice received training in combat, strategy, and etiquette. The bond was considered sacred, layered with ideals of loyalty and sacrifice sacrifice that sat at the center of samurai culture. Then, the Meiji Restoration arrived in 1868, and Japan opened its borders to Western influence. What followed wasn't just new laws, it was new vocabulary, imported words carrying imported shame. The older fluid language got replaced with fixed identities that hadn't existed in Japanese before. The concepts changed how people understood themselves. The words did more damage than any sword. Before colonies, the monks of Oaxaca still exist today. They hold a recognized place in community ceremonies, are invited to bless newborns, and are respected at public celebrations. This is not a modern development. It is a continuation of something that was already old when the Spanish arrived. Across dozens of North American nations, similar roles existed under different names. The Zuni had the Lamana. The Ojibwe had the Ikwekazo. Each role was distinct, belonging to a specific culture with its own language and its own logic. Centuries later, anthropologists collapsed all of it into a single borrowed term, Two-Spirit, a phrase that flattened an entire continent's worth of complexity into one label. The Aztec framework was different, harsher. The law recognized the same active and passive distinction that Rome and Assyria had used, but the punishment asymmetry here was extreme. The active party faced strangulation or public execution. The passive party faced something worse, disembowelment followed by burning alive. The Aztec state treated the passive body as a violation of the cosmic order, something that needed to be unmade completely. Then Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519. In his letters to the Spanish crown, he described what he found in precise, disgusted language. The orders that followed were immediate. Executions began within weeks. In some documented cases, men were thrown to war dogs, animals trained specifically for that purpose. What had existed across generations was gone in a season. The faith that drove those executions didn't appear overnight. It had been building for centuries, and it started with a reinterpretation of a single ancient text, faith and sin. The condemnation didn't arrive fully formed. It was built slowly, one reinterpretation at a time. Leviticus 18:22 is the verse most often cited. Written somewhere between the 7th and 5th centuries BC, scholars have long debated what it was originally targeting, likely specific ritual practices tied to competing religious traditions, not a broad prohibition on same-sex desire. The text was narrow. The interpretation that followed was not. The story of Sodom did the rest. A passage originally about hospitality violations and mob violence got reread across generations until it became the founding myth of a completely different condemnation. No single person decided this. The drift took centuries, each retelling hardening the meaning a little further until the original context was buried under the weight of what people needed it to say. Christianity added the layer that changed everything. Not just earthly punishment, eternal damnation. The psychological architecture of that addition was more controlling than any law because it didn't wait for you to be caught. It followed you into your own head. You could hide from a magistrate. You couldn't hide from your own conscience once it had been trained to treat desire as corruption. The Islamic tradition carried its own tension. Homoerotic poetry flourished openly in Abbasid court culture during the 8th and 9th centuries. Sufi mystical writing used the language of same-sex longing as spiritual metaphor. Simultaneously, legal codes in the same civilization carried the death penalty for the same acts. Two systems running in parallel, never quite colliding. What spread these frameworks wasn't debate. It was infrastructure. Confession as surveillance, canon law fused with state power, and eventually ships crossing oceans carrying the whole system with them. Empire and laws. Picture a present-day African leader at a podium declaring homosexuality un-African, a Western import, a foreign disease infecting traditional values. The crowd responds. The cameras roll. Now pull the thread. Section 377 of the British Penal Code was written in London in 1860 by a colonial administrator named Thomas Macaulay, who had never set foot in India. It criminalized sexual acts against the order of nature with penalties of up to 10 years imprisonment, then copied word for word into the legal codes of every British territory on Earth. Over 30 countries still have it on their books. India lived under that law for 157 years. The same country that produced the Kama Sutra and had recognized the Hijra, a third gender community, for thousands of years, criminalized its own people using a law written by a foreign administrator in a London office. It was struck down in 2018. The Spanish carried their own version into the Americas. The Inquisition followed the conquistadors. Indigenous practices that had existed for generations were reframed as savagery, justification for everything that came next. Executions were public. The message was deliberate. Return to that podium. That leader condemning Western influence is using legal language and moral frameworks that are direct colonial imports. The tradition he's defending never included these laws. The history runs exactly backward. Resistance and survival. Oscar Wilde wasn't destroyed by his trial. He was destroyed by what came after. The verdict in 1895 was 2 years of hard labor. Released in 1897, broke and exiled under a false name, he was dead within 3 years. The newspapers made the message clear. Nobody was safe. 2 decades later, the Nazis marked gay men in concentration camps with a pink triangle, an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 imprisoned. When the camps were liberated in 1945, many were transferred directly into civilian prisons under the exact same laws. The liberation applied to everyone else. In America, the Lavender Scare ran parallel to McCarthyism. Over 5,000 federal employees lost their jobs on the logic that they were blackmail risks. J. Edgar Hoover personally oversaw the investigation. The same man whose own private life, documented in FBI files, told a different story. Then, June 28, 1969, police raided the Stonewall Inn. Routine, one of hundreds that year. What changed was that people stopped leaving quietly. Today, 64 countries still criminalize same-sex relations. That map placed next to the British Empire's reach at its peak. The overlap is precise. In 2023, Uganda introduced the death penalty. In 2015, Ireland voted 62% for marriage equality. Taiwan followed in 2019. The erasure never worked. The record survived, and it is still being written.